Worship music.
Martin Luther once famously said that when the devil fell from heaven, he fell in the choir loft. The reason that he said this is that even in his day, music was one of the most controversial items in the church and in church worship. It divides us and it unites us. Today, the worship wars that have gone on between contemporary and traditional music have really hurt a lot of churches. What we're going to be looking today, though, is not what kind of music is best, but some general rules about worship music that we need to keep in mind and how it affects us as we worship.
Let's address some of the fundamental principles of Christian music. First, music is the language of the heart. It means so much to us because it is the way our souls talk to God. It's the way we express our emotions to Him. Music, even without words, can move us to a great emotional sense of peace, or anger, or excitement, or calm. It touches our emotions and our hearts. That's why we have music therapy. That's why we use Muzak in elevators, because it creates a mood just by listening to it. A certain pattern of sounds brings great emotional power and depth to us and touches in a way that words alone just cannot touch us. Second, though music is the language of the heart, we have to understand that music is not a universal language. Not everybody speaks the same emotional or musical language. We learn language of music just the way we learn language from our parents. We're not born reacting to certain kinds of sounds in a certain way. We learn that reaction through early associations with musical patterns or sounds. By the time we reach our mid-20s, most of us have already formed the musical language in which we speak. If we grow up with rock music, we find it exciting, we find it stimulating. If we don't grow up with rock music, we might find it just simply noise. We keep those associations that we develop by our mid-20s. Most of us keep them for the rest of our lives. Because of these two ideas, we can also draw a third idea, that if we grow up with old hymns, or if we grow up with contemporary Christian music, we'll probably keep the love for that music for the rest of our lives and enjoy those songs forever. But if we do not grow up with those, then odds are that we will never fully come to appreciate it, or it will never actually become the language of our heart. Problems come when we mix musical languages in church. The problems in the church arise when people who speak different musical languages meet together. What is new to one is old to the other. Worse than that, the same music that might move one to spiritual heights may sound like disorganized noise to another. Studies have been done on people who grew up with different musical styles, and they've shown that people who are not conditioned to appreciate a particular style of music, so for example jazz or bluegrass or classical, are not able to appreciate the abilities and the complexity of the music or of the performers. They just don't get it. It just sounds like noise to them. Rock music excites and motivates people who grew up with rock music, and so does rap or hip hop. But those who do not grow up with it just hear it as loud banging. Jazz is incredibly complex and improvisational, but to the uninitiated, it sounds like random noises. When it comes to the church, then, we must be careful to select Christian music that speaks not only to ourselves as worship leaders, but to the congregations we serve. Most musicians and worship leaders appreciate many more kinds of music than do their congregants, so we need to speak to our congregation and not to us. With that in mind, here are a few pointers about music in the church. First of all, speak the musical language of your congregation. It is not your job to improve your congregation's musical tastes. We are there to lead a congregation to Christ, not to Bach or to Mozart. Most of the time, it is impossible to change people's musical tastes anyway. There's not much point in trying. But you wouldn't try to educate your people to speak King James English in order to read the Bible, would you? So why would you try to educate them into an essential emotional language such as classical music or contemporary music in order to have them appreciate music and worship? Now, this may mean using songs that you personally don't like in worship. But then as worship leaders, we're not there for our own likes or dislikes. We're there to help people come to the throne of grace. We can also worship in our own way at home. Modern music is not necessarily the best way of communicating to every congregation or every culture. We need to assess the culture of the people who actually attend our church and not base our worship solely on who we want to attract. In a community where people are behind the times, there's no point in trying to fight it by being cutting edge. It is better to have people sing from the heart than to be contemporary. Second, mixed styles in a mixed church. Almost all churches are really a mixture of cultural groups and musical tastes. So when we plan worship, we should encourage the use of music that reaches a broad section of our whole congregation. We should not leave out the taste of older members, nor should we be so hidebound in our tradition that we try to sing the same old songs all the time. Let music reflect the taste of all the worshipers. And this is how we show love for one another, by listening and accepting people's music that perhaps we don't care for. Contemporary churches often have a problem in that long-standing members don't remain contemporary forever. In our culture, our musical styles change every 20 or 30 years. So what is contemporary now will be old-fashioned 20 years from now. If in our church we decide that we want to only be cutting edge and we only want to sing what's relevant now, then the people that have been there for 20 or 30 years are going to find themselves out of place and old-fashioned. We can't always be on the cutting edge. Sooner or later, we have to broaden our approach so that we have some of the old and some of the new. Focus in your worship on congregational involvement, not on professional performance. Congregational participation is a basic element of worship, and it cannot be ignored. If all we do is tell the congregation how they're supposed to worship, and all we do is put on a performance, then the people will never learn how to worship. We have not led them to the throne of Christ. We basically have ignored them. Musicians and worship leaders are frequently prone to be egotistical and self-glorifying, and love to perform and receive the accolades of people, rather than getting them to perform before the throne of grace. We do not need to give performances to people, but we need to lead people to Jesus. Don't let worship become a performance in your church. It should be a God-glorifying experience involving everyone. Do your best that you can, the best of your ability, to do good music, but don't let professionalism become an idol in your church. God does not demand perfection in music, nor does he demand excellence. God only expects us to do to the best of our ability. Musical excellence can be a trap for churches, but musical mediocrity is a definite turnout. We should do the best we can. Mediocre music can get in the way of the message and make it harder for a person to hear God's word. But don't let performance and don't let professionalism become an idol in your church. Focus on Christ and not on culture. People respond best when Jesus is lifted up. We must constantly remind people that Jesus is above culture. Most churches fight not over whether church music is culturally bound, because all church music is culturally bound, but whether the culture that the church music is bound to is the culture we want to support. Do we identify with traditional old school culture or with contemporary progressive culture? Either way, it is idolatrous unless the worship of Christ is preeminent. Our goal is to get people beyond the music to see the glory and the love of Christ. We have to speak to today, not yesterday. Even so, though, we must realize that to be relevant to the people we are today, that we need to be relevant to the people that we are today, not who we used to be. This is not saying that we should be contemporary necessarily. Sometimes a contemporary church may have to become more traditional if they're going to attract the people around them in more traditional ways. Do not make the mistake of sounding one way for the people's sake, for the one sounding in your music the way people sound who are no longer there. We want to reach out to our community, and if we want to do that, we have to speak musically, a language that our community understands. Emphasize words over music. Whatever form of music you choose, the words come first. Make sure that the message of God's grace and God's love is first. and do not allow the music to overwhelm the message of the words.
Paul said, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it to the glory of God. Worship music must first of all glorify God. Let the people become involved in your choice of music and teach them how to worship in majesty and love of Christ. And when they worship truly, then the music will glorify God.